October 18th, 1943. British 10th Corps headquarters near Calvi Vecchia, Italy. Staff Sergeant Robert Steinhaus watched as his hands trembled slightly while preparing the message capsule. 20 miles away, over 1,000 British soldiers sat in a captured Italian village, completely unaware that American bombers were warming their engines on a runway, preparing to obliterate everything within city limits. Every radio had failed. Every telegraph line was dead. The only hope for those soldiers now rested in the talons of a blue-checked pigeon named G.I. Joe, bred and trained by women who would never receive proper recognition for their role in the war. Steinhaus attached the tiny aluminum capsule to the bird's leg, knowing that in 20 minutes either a miracle would occur or an entire brigade would be wiped from existence by friendly fire. What he didn't know was that this single flight would prove what thousands of American women had been quietly demonstrating since 1943. Pigeons, trained by female hands, had become America's most reliable spies, achieving a 95% success rate when every modern technology failed. The story of how American women transformed an ancient communication method into World War II's most dependable intelligence network is one of the war's most overlooked achievements, a testament to patience, precision, and the revolutionary idea that women could master the science of avian communication better than anyone thought possible. The mathematics of this transformation were staggering. By 1945, women made up nearly half of all pigeon handlers in the US military, training and deploying birds that would deliver messages through conditions that destroyed radios, when telegraph lines lay severed, and where human messengers could not survive. These women, working in facilities from New Jersey to California, from Texas to Missouri, created a communication network so reliable that commanders trusted it more than the most advanced electronic equipment of the era. The foundation for this revolution began not in 1943, but decades earlier, when homing pigeons proved their worth in the carnage of World War I. During that conflict, the U.S. Army Signal Corps had employed 600 pigeons in France alone, with birds like Cher Ami becoming legendary for flights that saved entire battalions. Cher Ami, a small black Czech cock pigeon, had flown 25 miles through German gunfire in October 1918, delivering a message from the lost battalion despite being shot through the breast, losing an eye, and having half a leg blown away. The message he carried, found hanging from a ligament of his shattered leg, saved 194 American soldiers trapped behind enemy lines during the Meuse-Argonne offensive. For this feat, the French government awarded Cher Ami the Croix de Guerre with Palm, their highest military honor. When Cher Ami died in June 1919 from his wounds, the bird was mounted and placed in the Smithsonian Institution, where visitors could witness what courage looked like in feathers. For over a century there was debate about whether Cher Ami was male or female, as wartime records listed the bird as a hen, while the Smithsonian labeled him a cock bird. In 2021, DNA testing by the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, in collaboration with the National Zoo's Conservation Biology Institute, definitively confirmed that Cher Ami was male. Scientists extracted DNA from tissue samples taken from the stump of his right leg and analyzed sex-specific chromosomal sequences, finding only Z chromosomes with no W chromosomes present, confirming male sex in birds. The success of pigeons in World War I convinced the US Army to establish a permanent pigeon service after the armistice. In 1919, the chief signal officer created the Signal Corps Pigeon Breeding and Training Section at Camp Alfred Vale, New Jersey, which would later be renamed Fort Monmouth. The British, whose pigeon service had been legendary during the war, supplied 150 pairs of breeding birds to help establish the American program. These birds arrived without loss in October 1919, joining retired WWII hero pigeons in one fixed and 14 mobile lofts. Between the wars, the pigeoneers at Fort Monmouth devoted themselves to perfecting breeding techniques, training methods, and equipment. They developed specialized night-flying training from 1928 to 1930, teaching pigeons to navigate in darkness, something previously thought impossible. They perfected two-way pigeon training, birds that could fly to one location for water and return home for food, completing round trips of 56 miles in under 30 minutes. They even conducted experiments to train pigeons to fly over water, overcoming the widely accepted belief that homing pigeons were averse to crossing large bodies of water. By the time war clouds gathered over Europe in 1939, Fort Monmouth housed 75 pairs of breeding pigeons, 2 flying lofts with 100 birds for training, and 1 stationary loft with 30 long-distance flyers capable of 600-mile flights. The facility was breeding approximately 300 birds per season, maintaining lofts scattered across 18 locations throughout the United States and its territories. The Pigeon program represented more than just communication backup. It embodied a philosophy of redundancy and reliability that would prove essential in the chaos of modern warfare. Military planners understood that no single communication system could be trusted absolutely. Radio technology, while revolutionary, remained vulnerable to atmospheric conditions, enemy jamming, equipment failure, and the simple fact that batteries died and generators broke down in combat conditions. Telegraph required intact wires, which artillery fire severed with regularity. Human runners could be killed, captured, or simply lost in unfamiliar terrain. Pigeons, by contrast, required only instinct, training, and the will to return home. Then came Pearl Harbor. December 7, 1941 shattered American isolationism and transformed the Pigeon service from a small specialized unit into a massive wartime operation. The Army Signal Corps faced an unprecedented challenge. Modern warfare required thousands of trained pigeons, far more than Fort Monmouth could produce alone. Radio communications, while revolutionary, proved unreliable in combat conditions. Mountains blocked signals, weather interfered with transmissions, equipment failed under battlefield stress, and enemy forces could intercept or jam radio frequencies. Pigeons, by contrast, were immune to electronic countermeasures, required no batteries or fuel, and could navigate through conditions that grounded aircraft and silenced radios. General John Pershing, who had witnessed the effectiveness of French and British pigeon services during World War I, understood the strategic value of these birds. Under his authorization, the Army launched a massive mobilization effort, not just for pigeons, but for the people who would breed, train, and deploy them. The challenge was enormous. The Army needed 54,000 trained pigeons and 3,150 pigeoneers to handle them. This demand exceeded the capacity of the existing all-male Pigeoneer Corps by orders of magnitude. Traditional military thinking held that women lacked the physical capability and technical aptitude for such specialized work. Pigeon handling required strength to carry heavy feed bags, sometimes weighing 50 pounds or more. It demanded technical knowledge of nutrition, disease prevention, and animal behavior. It involved driving vehicles across rural areas to retrieve lost birds, often in difficult terrain and poor weather. Most critically, it required the ability to form working relationships with animals that could be stubborn, aggressive, or unpredictable. The conventional wisdom suggested that women, while perhaps suited for nursing or clerical work, couldn't handle the demands of military pigeon service. This conventional wisdom was about to be shattered completely. The solution arrived in 1943 with a revolutionary decision that would change military pigeon service forever. The U.S. Navy opened its Specialist Ex-Pigeon Trainer rating to the women accepted for volunteer emergency service, known as WWIIs. For the first time in American military history, women would be trained as professional pigeon handlers, equal to men in every aspect of the demanding specialty. The decision wasn't made out of progressive ideology or commitment to gender equality. It was made out of desperate necessity. The Navy needed pigeon trainers, and it needed them immediately. Traditional recruitment channels couldn't provide enough qualified male candidates. Women represented an untapped labor pool with exactly the skills the pigeon service needed. Many women had grown up on farms, with experience caring for livestock and poultry. Many had kept pet birds, understanding avian behavior and needs. Many possessed the patience and attention to detail that pigeon training demanded. The question wasn't whether women could do the work. The question was whether the military would give them the chance. The requirements for female pigeon trainers were identical to those for men, with no accommodations or lowered standards. Candidates needed experience working with birds or other animals, demonstrating an understanding of animal behavior and welfare. They had to know how to drive automobiles, a skill essential for retrieving pigeons that got lost during training flights. sometimes wandering dozens of miles from their intended destinations. They needed physical stamina to clean and maintain lofts, carry heavy bags of feed, and handle birds that could be aggressive or frightened. Most importantly, they needed patience, attention to detail, and the ability to form bonds with animals that would trust them enough to fly through enemy fire. The women who volunteered for pigeon training came from diverse backgrounds. Some were farmers' daughters who had grown up caring for chickens and livestock. Others were city dwellers who had kept canaries or parakeets as pets. Some had worked as veterinary assistants or in pet stores. A few had even been involved in pigeon racing, a popular hobby in many American cities during the pre-war years. What they all shared was a willingness to serve their country and a love for animals that would prove essential to their success. The training program, based at Naval Air Station Lakehurst, New Jersey, was grueling and comprehensive. Women learned every aspect of pigeon care, from the precise nutritional requirements needed to maintain peak flying condition to the subtle signs of illness that could ground a bird. They studied the specialized diet formula developed during World War I, 50% Canada peas, 25% Argentine corn, 15% Kaffir corn or Milo maize, and 10% whole rice, portions that provided the perfect balance of energy for long-distance flights. The diet wasn't arbitrary. Each component served a specific purpose. Canada peas provided protein for muscle development. Argentine corn offered carbohydrates for energy. Kaffir corn supplied additional nutrients and helped with digestion. Whole rice added variety and prevented dietary boredom that could cause birds to stop eating. The proportions had been refined over decades of experimentation, and handlers learned to adjust them based on factors like weather conditions, training intensity, and individual bird needs. They learned when to bathe the birds, every other day, but never on extremely cold days when wet feathers could lead to hypothermia, and how to build rapport with individual pigeons, each bird having its own personality and quirks. Some pigeons were naturally friendly and eager to interact with humans. Others were shy or suspicious, requiring weeks of patient contact before they would accept handling without stress. The trainers learned to recognize these personalities and adapt their approach accordingly. They mastered the art of properly holding a pigeon without causing stress or injury, supporting the bird's body while securing the wings to prevent sudden flapping that could injure delicate bones. The technique looked simple but required practice to perfect. Hold too loosely and the bird would escape. Hold too tightly and you risked causing injury or creating fear that would make future handling difficult. They learned how often to clean perches and nest boxes, maintaining sanitation that prevented disease while providing comfortable living conditions. Loft hygiene wasn't just about cleanliness. It was about disease prevention in facilities housing hundreds of birds in close proximity. A single sick pigeon could infect an entire loft within days, potentially destroying months of training and leaving military units without communication capability. The women learned to spot early signs of common diseases like salmonellosis, which killed hundreds of pigeons in training facilities during the war. They studied the construction and maintenance of mobile lofts, structures that could be transported with advancing troops, allowing pigeons to establish new home bases as battle lines shifted. Mobile lofts were engineering marvels, designed to be lightweight enough for transport while providing adequate protection from weather and predators. They incorporated ventilation systems, nesting boxes, feeding stations and landing boards, all in a package that could be loaded onto trucks and moved to new locations as military operations progressed. They practiced attaching message capsules to pigeons' legs, tiny aluminum containers that could hold rolled paper messages, and in emergencies, blood samples or even miniature cameras. The capsules came in two colors. Black indicated routine messages requiring attention but not immediate emergency response. Red capsules meant life or death situations where every second counted. When ground crews saw a pigeon arrive with a red capsule, all other activities stopped immediately. The training also covered the specialized equipment developed for pigeon service. Women learned about the pigeon vests manufactured by Maidenform. The Brassiere company contracted to produce 28,500 protective garments for paratroopers carrying birds into combat. The vests, designed using the same construction techniques as Brassiere's, consisted of porous material with tightly woven fabric underneath to prevent damage from the bird's claws. They contained only the pigeon's body, leaving the head, feet and wings free for breathing and comfort. Adjustable straps allowed paratroopers to secure the vests to their chests during jumps. Critical warnings were stamped on each vest. Do not retain pigeon in vest in excess of 6 hours. The designers understood that prolonged confinement would stress the birds and potentially reduce flying capability. Perhaps most critically, they learned the psychology of homing pigeons, understanding the mysterious ability that allowed these birds to navigate hundreds of miles back to their lofts through conditions that would disorient any human. Scientists still don't fully understand this ability, though modern research suggests it involves multiple factors. Magnetoreception appears to play a crucial role, as pigeons can detect Earth's magnetic field and use it like a compass for determining direction. They also appear to use landmark recognition, memorizing visual features of terrain along their routes. Their superior eyesight allows them to see details from altitude that would be invisible to humans. Some research suggests they can even detect infrasound, very low-frequency sound waves that travel great distances and provide information about terrain features beyond the visual horizon. The pigeons couldn't fly in complete darkness or heavy fog, conditions that eliminated their ability to use visual landmarks. But they could navigate through artillery fire, poison gas, severe weather, and enemy territory that would stop any other form of communication. The women who completed this training joined a specialized rating designated specialist ex-pigeon trainer, receiving the same pay and responsibilities as their male counterparts. The specialist X rating had been created in late 1941 to allow for new enlisted ratings needed during wartime that didn't fall within the established Navy structure. It covered various specialists, including pigeon trainers, but also artists, cartographers, intelligence specialists, key punch operators, plastics experts, public information specialists, switchboard operators, and topographic draftsmen. The rating opened to waves in 1943, and women soon proved they could excel in these technical specialties that traditional military thinking had reserved exclusively for men. They were assigned to naval air stations across the United States, from Lakehurst, New Jersey to Santa Ana, California, from Pensacola, Florida to Seattle, Washington. At these stations, they managed lofts housing anywhere from 50 to 200 pigeons, maintaining breeding programs, conducting training flights, and preparing birds for deployment to combat zones. Specialist second-class Marcelle Whiteman became one of the most photographed waves pigeon trainers, her official Navy portrait showing her gently cradling one of the 200 carrier pigeons based at Naval Air Station Santa Ana, California, in June 1945. The photograph, now preserved in the National Archives under designation 80-G-K-5489, captures something remarkable in Whiteman's expression, not just competence or duty, but genuine affection for the bird in her hands. Her uniform is crisp and professional, her posture confident, her handling of the pigeon gentle yet secure. The bird appears calm in her grasp, a testament to the bond between trainer and animal. This emotional connection between trainer and pigeon proved essential to the program's success. Pigeons, despite popular misconceptions, are highly intelligent creatures capable of recognizing individual human faces, remembering locations for years, and forming strong bonds with their caretakers. Research has since shown that pigeons can distinguish between hundreds of different images, remember sequences of actions, and even perform basic mathematical operations. They're not the bird-brained creatures of stereotype, but sophisticated animals with cognitive abilities that rival many mammals. The birds trained by women like Whiteman weren't just following instinct, they were returning to handlers they knew and trusted, flying through hell to reach the people who fed them, cared for them, and treated them as partners rather than tools. This distinction mattered enormously in combat conditions. A pigeon that viewed its handler as a source of food would return home reliably under normal conditions. But a pigeon that had bonded with its handler, that associated the human with safety and comfort, would push through injuries, exhaustion, and terror to complete its mission. The difference between these two levels of motivation could mean the difference between a message delivered and a mission failed. between soldiers saved and soldiers lost. The scale of the women's contribution to the Pigeon service extended far beyond the Navy's WWII program. While the Navy provided the most visible and well-documented example of female pigeon trainers, with official photographs, service records, and public recognition, women worked throughout the Army Pigeon service as well, though often in civilian capacities that left fewer official records. Military bureaucracy of the era didn't always carefully document civilian workers, particularly women, meaning that much of their contribution remains invisible in historical archives. At Fort Monmouth, women handled administrative duties that kept the entire pigeon service running smoothly. They maintained breeding records, tracking bloodlines across generations to identify the most successful genetic combinations. They managed supply logistics, ensuring that lofts received proper feed, medical supplies, and equipment. They staffed veterinary support operations, assisting the Veterinary Corps officers assigned to pigeon facilities beginning in 1941. They worked in training programs, teaching new pigeoneers the skills needed to manage birds in combat conditions. At Camp Crowder, Missouri, which became the Army's primary pigeon breeding and training center from October 1943 to June 1946, women worked alongside male pigeoneers in every capacity except direct combat deployment. They bred birds, trained young squeakers, conducted flight exercises, maintained lofts, and prepared pigeons for shipment to combat zones. The fact that their names appear less frequently in official records doesn't diminish their contribution. It simply reflects the systematic underreporting of women's military service that characterized the era. The demand for pigeons was staggering and grew more intense as the war progressed. By 1943, the Army's pigeon breeding centers needed to produce 1,000 birds per month just to maintain operational levels, replacing losses from combat, training accidents, disease, and natural attrition. Fort Monmouth alone had emergency breeding capacity of 1,000 birds monthly, representing about 1/4 of the Army's maximum anticipated requirements. Meeting this demand required expertise in selective breeding that went far beyond simply allowing birds to mate randomly. To meet this extraordinary demand, the military relied heavily on voluntary donations from American pigeon fanciers, hobbyists who had spent years and sometimes decades breeding racing pigeons for competition. Pigeon racing had been a popular hobby in America since the late 19th century, with clubs in major cities organizing races that tested birds' speed and homing ability over distances ranging from 50 miles to 600 miles or more. The American Racing Pigeon Union and the International Federation of American Homing Pigeon Fanciers coordinated the wartime donation drive, and the response was overwhelming. Pigeon clubs across the nation contributed their finest birds, sometimes even champion racers worth hundreds of dollars, birds that had won prestigious races and could have commanded high prices in peacetime markets. One shipment from New York City alone contained 52,000 pigeons, an astonishing outpouring of patriotic sacrifice. By 1943, American pigeon fanciers had voluntarily donated approximately 40,000 of the 54,000 birds the Signal Corps furnished to the armed services during the war. These donated birds weren't random street pigeons or common barnyard fowl. They were the offspring of champions, birds whose bloodlines had won races covering 600 miles in a single day, flying at speeds approaching 60 miles per hour over short distances and maintaining 35 to 40 miles per hour over long flights. These were athletes, bred over generations for speed, endurance, and that mysterious homing instinct that allowed them to find their way across vast distances under challenging conditions. Some bloodlines traced back to legendary racing families in Europe, birds whose ancestors had competed in prestigious races dating back to the 19th century. The women at the breeding centers worked to enhance these natural abilities through scientific breeding programs. They crossbred the fastest, strongest birds with those showing the best homing instincts, creating new generations that exceeded their parents' capabilities. They maintained detailed records of every mating, tracking which combinations produced offspring with superior characteristics. They monitored health, temperament, flying ability, and homing success rates, using this data to guide future breeding decisions. A World War I pigeon might fly 200 miles in one flight, an impressive feat by historical standards. By World War II, the birds bred and trained at facilities like Fort Monmouth could easily double that distance. Some exceptional birds could travel 600 miles, a feat that would have been considered impossible just 2 decades earlier. This improvement came from generations of careful selective breeding combined with enhanced nutrition and training methods. The training process itself was a masterpiece of patience and precision, skills that the female handlers demonstrated in abundance. Young pigeons, called squeakers due to the sounds they made while begging for food, were placed in lofts 5 weeks after hatching. This was a critical period in their development, when they were old enough to begin learning, but young enough that their homing instinct could be properly shaped. For the first weeks, handlers would pick up and hold each bird daily, allowing them to become comfortable with human contact. This wasn't just about socialization. It was about building the fundamental trust that would later motivate the birds to return home under combat conditions. The birds learned to associate handlers with food, safety, and care, building the bond that would later compel them to fly through gunfire to return home. Initial training flights began with releases just a few hundred feet from the loft, short distances that allowed handlers to observe each bird's basic homing ability and willingness to fly. Gradually, distances increased to 1 mile, then 2 miles, then 4 miles. The handlers would transport birds in special baskets to release points, noting which birds returned quickly and which seemed hesitant or confused. Birds that showed strong homing instinct early were marked for advanced training. Those that seemed confused or unwilling to fly were given additional basic training or, in some cases, removed from the program. Advanced training involved shifting mobile lofts from location to location, teaching the pigeons to recognize a new home base and navigate to it from unfamiliar territory. This simulated combat conditions, where lofts would move forward with advancing troops, requiring birds to establish new home positions regularly. The process required weeks of patient work, moving the loft progressively farther from the bird's original home while conducting training flights from various directions. The most challenging training involved preparing birds for combat conditions that went far beyond anything in nature. Handlers exposed pigeons to loud noises, simulating artillery fire and explosions. They used recordings of battle sounds, starting at low volumes and gradually increasing intensity until birds could remain calm through deafening noise. They released birds in adverse weather, teaching them to navigate through rain, wind, and poor visibility. They conducted releases from moving vehicles and even from aircraft, preparing the birds for the reality of being launched from positions under enemy fire. They simulated the stress of combat by restricting food before flights, mimicking the conditions birds might face if trapped behind enemy lines with handlers under siege. Throughout all this training, the handlers observed each bird's individual personality and capabilities, noting differences that would prove crucial in combat deployment. Some pigeons showed exceptional speed but limited endurance, sprinters rather than marathon flyers. Others were slower but more reliable over long distances, steady workers that wouldn't quit even when exhausted. Some birds remained calm under stress, while others panicked at unexpected sounds or situations. Some were aggressive and difficult to handle, while others were docile and cooperative. The best handlers learned to match each bird's strengths to specific mission requirements, ensuring that the right bird was chosen for each situation. This personalized approach, understanding and working with each bird's unique characteristics, became a hallmark of the female-led training programs. While male pigeoneers certainly demonstrated skill and dedication throughout the war, contemporary accounts and post-war evaluations suggest that women often brought a different sensibility to the work, one emphasizing relationship and communication over pure mechanical training. Women tended to spend more time with individual birds, learning their personalities and preferences. They were more likely to notice subtle changes in behavior that indicated stress or illness. They approached training as a partnership rather than simply conditioning animals to perform tasks. Whether this difference stemmed from socialization, natural temperament, or cultural expectations remains debatable. What's indisputable is that it worked. The results spoke for themselves with unmistakable clarity. Pigeons trained by female handlers achieved the same 95% success rate as those trained by men, a rate of reliability that exceeded every other communication method available during the war. More than 90% of messages sent by Pigeon reached their intended destinations, compared to success rates of 70 to 80% for radio communications in combat conditions and even lower rates for human runners who could be killed, captured, or simply lost in unfamiliar terrain. The true test of this training came not in stateside exercises or controlled conditions, but on battlefields across Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific, where chaos reigned and nothing worked as planned. 36,000 pigeons were deployed overseas, serving with 12 signal pigeon companies throughout every theatre of operation. These birds, many trained by women who would never see combat themselves, became the lifeline for troops in situations where every other communication method had failed, where radios were jammed or destroyed, where telegraph wires lay severed by artillery, where runners couldn't penetrate enemy lines. The most famous example came on that October morning in 1943, when G.I. Joe carried out the flight that would earn him the Dickin Medal, the highest award for animal gallantry instituted by the British. G.I. Joe had been hatched on March 24, 1943 in Algiers, North Africa, from parent birds brought from the United States by members of the 6681 Signal Pigeon Company. He was a blue check-splashed cock, his feathers marked with the distinctive pattern that identified his breeding. He received the designation USA 43 SC 6390, stamped on an aluminum band attached to his leg, and underwent the two-way homing pigeon training perfected at Fort Monmouth by handlers who understood that his life might someday depend on the quality of their work. By October, he was stationed with British forces in Italy, under the care of Staff Sergeant Robert Steinhaus of Merrill, Wisconsin, and Technician 5th Grade Elroy Rausch of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. These pigeoneers had spent months working with G.I. Joe and the other birds in their mobile loft, building relationships that would prove crucial under combat pressure. On October 18th, the British 169th Infantry Brigade of the 56th London Division captured the heavily fortified village of Calvi Vecchia ahead of schedule, encountering far less resistance than expected. The Germans had withdrawn during the night, abandoning defensive positions they had held for weeks, leaving the village undefended. This was wonderful news that should have been cause for celebration, except for one critical and potentially catastrophic problem. Hours earlier, before the British attack began, the brigade had requested American air support to bomb German positions in the village. That bombing run was scheduled for shortly after the British expected to begin their assault, and the American 12th Air Support Command bombers were already on the runway at their base 20 miles away, engines warming, pilots receiving final clearance for takeoff. The British frantically tried to cancel the bombing through every means available. They sent radio messages on multiple frequencies. The radios were jammed by German electronic countermeasures or simply failed to reach the American base due to terrain features that blocked transmission. They attempted telegraph communication using field wires. The lines had been cut by German artillery during the recent fighting. They sent vehicle-mounted runners with orders to reach the airbase by the fastest route possible. The runners couldn't cover the distance in time, and enemy positions blocked direct routes. At British 10th Corps headquarters, 20 miles from Calvi Vecchia, the situation was desperate and growing more so with each passing minute. Over 1,000 British soldiers occupied the village, along with countless Italian civilians who had survived the German occupation and were now emerging from shelters, believing themselves liberated. In minutes, American bombs would begin falling on friendly forces, and there appeared to be no way to stop the impending tragedy. Staff Sergeant Steinhaus made the only decision possible under the circumstances. He pulled G.I. Joe from his basket in the mobile loft, checked the bird's condition to ensure he was healthy and ready to fly, attached the aluminum message capsule containing the urgent cancellation order to the bird's leg, using the technique he had practiced thousands of times, and released him into the Italian sky. The message was brief and urgent, composed in the military shorthand developed for pigeon communications where every word counted. British forces had captured Calvi Vecchia ahead of schedule. German resistance had collapsed. American air support was no longer needed. Abort the bombing immediately to prevent massive friendly fire casualties. G.I. Joe flew the 20 miles in 20 minutes, an average speed of 60 miles per hour maintained across terrain that included hills, valleys, and areas still controlled by German forces. He flew over positions where enemy soldiers would have shot him down if they had realized he carried military messages. He navigated by instinct and training, using landmarks he had learned during preparation flights, using the magnetic sense that guided him home, driven by the bond with his handlers and the knowledge that safety and food waited at the end of the flight. He arrived at the American airbase just as the bombers were about to lift off, engines roaring at full power, pilots running final pre-flight checks, bombardiers verifying target coordinates, crews preparing for a mission they believed would destroy German defensive positions. A Pigeon handler stationed at the base saw the red emergency capsule on WWII's leg and immediately alerted the command staff, knowing that red capsules meant life-or-death situations requiring instant action. Officers read the message and frantically ordered the bombing run aborted, shouting orders that sent personnel running across the airfield. Pilots powered down their engines, confused but following orders without question. Bombs were unloaded from aircraft that had been seconds from takeoff. The mission was cancelled with literally minutes to spare, possibly less. G.I. Joe's flight saved the lives of over 1,000 British soldiers and untold numbers of Italian civilians who would have died in the bombing. For this achievement, he was awarded the Dickin Medal in November 1946, presented personally by the Lord Mayor of London in a ceremony that recognised his extraordinary service. The citation read, "For the most outstanding flight made by a United States Army Pigeon in World War II." He was the only American pigeon to receive this honour, though dozens of other American birds performed feats of equal courage that simply weren't as dramatically visible or as well documented. But G.I. Joe's story, while the most celebrated and widely publicised, was merely one example among thousands of successful pigeon flights that saved lives and won battles throughout the war. In early 1944, on Monte Cassino, southeast of Rome, where Allied forces were attempting to break through German defensive lines in some of the war's bloodiest fighting, a company of Nepali Gurkhas and British troops fought their way onto a massive outcropping called Hangman's Hill, only to be pinned down by devastating German fire from surrounding positions. They were trapped for 9 days with no means of communication with their forces below, completely cut off from resupply or reinforcement, facing annihilation from German attacks or starvation if relief didn't arrive. Finally, after days of unsuccessful attempts to break through German lines or establish any form of communication, 3 British volunteers set out toward the trapped men, each taking a different route to maximize the chances that at least one would get through. Each volunteer carried a haversack with an American homing pigeon inside, birds trained at facilities where women like Marcel Whiteman and thousands of others had prepared them for exactly this kind of mission under the most difficult conditions imaginable. One volunteer was pinned down by machine gun fire within minutes of leaving friendly lines and couldn't advance further without certain death. The other 2 volunteers, moving at night and using cover, managed to penetrate German lines through gaps in enemy positions and reached the trapped soldiers after hours of dangerous infiltration. All 3 volunteers quickly scribbled messages describing the safe routes they had taken, routes that avoided German strongpoints and could potentially allow relief forces to reach the trapped men. They attached these messages to the pigeons and released the birds into hostile skies, knowing that these birds represented the trapped soldiers' only hope for survival. The pigeons flew through German territory, navigating by instinct and training, returning to their loft behind Allied lines despite enemy soldiers who would have shot them down if given the opportunity. That night, Allied artillery opened fire along the safe paths the scouts had identified, using carefully calculated barrages to clear German positions without hitting the routes the trapped soldiers would use. The trapped soldiers slipped away to safety under cover of darkness, moving through the gaps that artillery had created, every one of them owing their lives to the pigeons that had delivered those crucial messages through conditions where no other communication method could have succeeded. In the Pacific Theatre, pigeons proved equally vital, though the conditions were even more challenging than anything faced in Europe. The tropical climate, with its extreme heat, humidity, and violent storms, tested both birds and handlers to their limits. Pigeons evolved for temperate climates struggled with heat stress in jungle conditions. Humidity affected their feathers and flying ability. Tropical diseases threatened loft populations. Yet through careful management and adaptation, pigeoneers made the system work even under these adverse conditions. On July 12, 1945, near Madang, New Guinea, a boat from the 55th Port Craft Company experienced engine failure in heavy seas, one of countless mechanical failures that plagued military operations in the Pacific's harsh conditions. The vessel, carrying valuable stores, ammunition and equipment needed by forces preparing for the invasion of Japan, was being driven onto the beach at Wadao by powerful waves, rapidly filling with sand that threatened to bury the cargo and possibly sink the boat entirely. Radio communication was impossible in the storm conditions that had caused the engine failure in the first place. The boat's commander made a desperate decision, releasing a pigeon designated as Blue Bar Cock Pigeon number 139, a bird that had previously completed 23 operational flights over a total distance of 1,004 miles, proving his reliability time and again. The bird, trained to fly in tropical conditions despite the challenges of heat and humidity, launched into a severe tropical storm with winds that threatened to dash him into the ocean. For 50 minutes, the pigeon fought through torrential rain that soaked his feathers and made flying exhausting, through fierce winds that threatened to blow him off course, flying 40 miles to reach the loft at Madang where handlers waited. The message in the aluminum capsule read, "Engine failed. Wash on to beach at WADAU owing very heavy seas. Send help immediately. Am rapidly filling with sand." Thanks to that message delivered under impossible conditions, rescue teams located the boat and salvaged the vessel along with its cargo of stores, ammunition and equipment that would have been lost otherwise. Blue Bar Cock number 139 was awarded the Dickin Medal for this flight, recognition of both this specific mission and his long record of reliable service. These dramatic rescue missions represented the visible pinnacle of the pigeon service, the stories that made newspapers and earned medals, but the daily reality involved countless routine flights that kept communication lines open when electronics failed. The routine missions rarely made headlines, but were no less important to military operations. Pigeons carried weather reports from forward observation posts, intelligence about enemy movements, requests for medical supplies, notifications of casualty numbers, and thousands of other messages that kept military operations functioning. Paratroopers jumping into Normandy on D-Day, June 6, 1944, carried pigeons in specially designed vests manufactured by the Maidenform Brassiere Company, an unlikely but perfectly logical contractor for this specialized equipment. The Army had contracted with Maidenform in December 1944 to produce 28,500 pigeon vests, adapting the company's expertise in intimate apparel design to create a garment that would protect pigeons during the violent stress of parachute jumps. The pigeon vest was essentially a bra-like garment specifically designed for avian use, constructed from porous materials with tightly woven fabric underneath to prevent damage from the bird's claws during the confined carry. It contained only the pigeon's body, leaving the head, feet and wings free to ensure the bird could breathe properly and wouldn't suffer injuries from confinement. Adjustable straps allowed paratroopers to secure the vests to their chests, carrying the birds safely through the jump while keeping their hands free for managing their own parachutes and equipment. Once on the ground behind enemy lines, the paratroopers would undo the vests and release the pigeons to carry messages back to command, maintaining radio silence that prevented German forces from detecting their positions through radio direction finding. The vests came with strict instructions prominently displayed and repeatedly emphasized in training. Do not retain pigeon in vest in excess of 6 hours. The designers understood from experience and research that prolonged confinement would stress the birds severely and potentially reduce their flying capability to the point where they might not be able to complete their missions. Even in the chaos of combat, even when paratroopers were fighting for their lives against German forces, the welfare of these living communication devices remained a priority because their effectiveness depended on their health and well-being. The success of the Pigeon program in combat validated years of training provided by handlers at facilities throughout the United States. At Naval Air Station Lakehurst, New Jersey, Waves Pigeon trainers prepared birds for deployment on naval blimps, conducting anti-submarine patrols along the Atlantic coast. These lighter-than-air craft, inflated with helium and powered by engines that allowed them to patrol for hours searching for German U-boats, carried 6 crated Pigeons on every patrol mission. The Pigeons served as backup communication when radio silence was required to avoid alerting submarines to the blimp's presence, or when equipment failed due to the harsh salt air environment that corroded electronics. The Pigeons were carried in special watertight containers designed to survive if the blimp had to ditch at sea, a real possibility given that German submarines sometimes surfaced to shoot down Allied aircraft with deck guns. The women who worked in these facilities were performing a role that traditional military thinking had deemed impossible for females. The pre-war military establishment had assumed that women lacked the physical strength, technical knowledge, and emotional temperament required for military pigeon service. The success of women like Marcel Whiteman and thousands of others shattered these assumptions completely and irreversibly. Not only could women handle the physical demands of the work, lifting heavy feed bags weighing 50 pounds or more, cleaning lofts that required scrubbing and disinfecting, and managing birds that could be aggressive or difficult, they excelled at the interpersonal aspects of the job that proved equally critical to success. The bond between handler and pigeon wasn't just sentimental, it was tactical and operational. Pigeons flew home not just by instinct but by motivation, by the emotional drive to return to familiar people and places. They returned to the people and places they knew and trusted, to the handlers who fed them and cared for them day after day. The stronger that bond, the more reliable the bird's performance under stress and danger. A pigeon that viewed its handler merely as a source of food would return home reliably under normal conditions, but might give up when injured or exhausted. A pigeon that had bonded emotionally with its handler would push through injuries, exhaustion, and terror to complete its mission, because returning meant more than just food, it meant safety, comfort, and the presence of someone who cared. Women handlers understood this principle intuitively, bringing skills developed in civilian life through caring for pets, raising children, managing households, to a military context that desperately needed those capabilities, but hadn't recognized their value until necessity forced the issue. The numbers tell an undeniable story of success. By 1945, approximately 100,000 women had served as waves in the US Navy, making unprecedented contributions to the war effort. While the majority worked in clerical roles that freed men for combat duty, 23,000 served in the Bureau of Aeronautics, including the pigeon trainers who formed a critical part of naval aviation operations. In the Army, exact numbers of female pigeon handlers are harder to document, as many served in civilian capacities that left fewer official records in military archives, but their impact was no less significant to operations. The pigeons trained by these women compiled a record that exceeded the most optimistic projections when the program began. More than 90% of messages sent by US Army pigeons were successfully delivered, a rate of reliability that no electronic communication system could match under combat conditions. Over the course of the war, pigeons were credited with saving thousands of lives, delivering messages when radios failed, telegraph lines were cut, and weather conditions grounded aircraft. 32 pigeons received the Dickin Medal for gallantry, the highest award for animal bravery instituted by the British to recognise extraordinary service. The end of the war brought a moment of reckoning for the pigeon service and the people who had made it work. With the advent of more reliable radio communications, improved equipment, and the development of technologies like radar and encrypted transmissions, the military questioned whether carrier pigeons still had a place in modern warfare. The answer, at least initially, was yes, but with qualifications. The Army and Navy maintained their pigeon services into the post-war period, recognizing that despite technological advances, there would always be situations where the reliability of a living courier outweighed the sophistication of electronics. The Waves program, which had been established for the duration of the war plus 6 months according to its original authorization, faced demobilization in 1945 and 1946. But the Navy discovered that the women had become a crucial element of military service that couldn't simply be dismissed. Their skills, dedication, and effectiveness had proven indispensable across dozens of specialties. The passage of the Women's Armed Forces Integration Act of 1948 gave women a permanent place in the U.S. military, ensuring that the contributions made by WWIIs like Marcel Whiteman would not be forgotten or dismissed as temporary wartime expedients that could be discarded when men returned from combat. The Pigeon service itself continued until 1957, when the Department of the Army finally discontinued using pigeons as message carriers, concluding that technological advances had finally rendered the birds obsolete for military purposes. By then, reliable transistor radios, improved encryption, and satellite communications had created redundancy that made pigeon backup unnecessary. Yet even at the end, the birds' reliability and courage had never been in question. The decision to end the program was purely about technological superiority, not any failure of the birds or their handlers. When the service ended, 15 hero pigeons were donated to zoos across the country, allowing the public to see these living legends and learn about their remarkable service. The remaining 1,000 or so birds at Fort Monmouth were sold to the public for $5 per pair, a nominal price that reflected the military's desire to see the birds go to good homes rather than maximize revenue. The sale attracted enormous interest from pigeon racing enthusiasts and veterans who had worked with the birds during the war. Robert S. Deeder, a former Signal Corps instructor at Fort Monmouth who raced pigeons as a hobby, remembered being 15th or 18th in line when hundreds of people descended on the fort hoping to acquire birds with such distinguished bloodlines. Deeder purchased 10 pairs, though he admitted none of them did much for him in racing competitions, perhaps because the traits that made military pigeons successful, reliability and steady performance, differed from the traits prized in racing, pure speed over familiar courses. The hero pigeons went to their new homes with ceremony befitting their extraordinary service. G.Y. Joe, who had lived in retirement at the Churchill Loft at Fort Monmouth alongside 24 other heroic pigeons in comfortable conditions that recognized their status, was transferred to the Detroit Zoological Gardens, where he lived until June 3, 1961, dying at the age of 18 years, a respectable lifespan for a pigeon. His body was mounted and displayed at the U.S. Army Communications Electronics Museum at Fort Monmouth, where visitors could see the bird who had saved over 1,000 lives with one 20-minute flight. The memorial to all military pigeons was dedicated at Fort Monmouth on July 14, 1960, as part of the U.S. Army Signal Corps Centennial Celebration, marking 100 years of military communications. The monument, modelled on G.Y. Joe and featuring a pigeon atop a fountain, bore a simple plaque reading, "A memorial to homing pigeons in combat, courage, loyalty, endurance." The memorial stood as testament to the thousands of birds and hundreds of handlers who had served in relative anonymity, their contributions known only to the soldiers whose lives they saved, and the military historians who studied their remarkable achievements. For the women who trained these birds, recognition came slowly and incompletely. Unlike male pigeoneers, who often received formal commendations and whose names appear prominently in military records and unit histories, many female handlers worked in positions that generated little documentation that survived in archives. Photographs like the one of Marcel Whiteman at Naval Air Station Santa Ana survive as occasional glimpses of women whose daily work proved essential to the war effort, but whose names and stories were rarely recorded with the same detail afforded to male personnel. This pattern of incomplete recognition reflected broader issues in how women's military service was documented and remembered. What records do exist paint a picture of extraordinary competence and dedication that deserves recognition. The women who trained military pigeons weren't doing women's work as some lesser category of service. They were doing the work, period, performing a highly technical military specialty with the same standards and expectations as their male counterparts. This equality of capability, demonstrated under wartime conditions where failure meant deaths, provided powerful evidence for the case that would eventually lead to women's permanent integration into the armed forces. On that October morning in 1943, when G.I. Joe lifted off from British 10th Corps headquarters carrying the message that would save over 1,000 lives, he was carrying more than information in the aluminum capsule attached to his leg. He was carrying proof that women could master any technical skill when given proper training and opportunity. He was carrying evidence that appropriate technology sometimes means choosing reliability over sophistication. He was carrying the cumulative efforts of hundreds of handlers who had bred, trained, and prepared birds like him for exactly this kind of mission. Most of all, he was carrying hope for soldiers who knew that bombs were minutes away. G.I. Joe completed that 20-mile flight because handlers at facilities across America had maintained standards of excellence that ensured every bird had the capability to perform when called upon. The message G.I. Joe carried was written by British officers in Italy, but the ability to deliver that message was created by American women working thousands of miles from the battlefield. Women whose names we will likely never know. Women whose stories deserve to be told. This is the story of how American women turned pigeons into World War II's most reliable spies. A story of patience overcoming technology, of competence shattering stereotypes, and of quiet excellence achieving results that shaped the outcome of the war. The women who trained these birds changed both military history and the trajectory of women's service in the armed forces. They did it one bird at a time, one training flight at a time, one message delivered successfully at a time, proving that capability knows no gender and that excellence requires only opportunity and training.